I have presided over thousands of cases during my years on the bench. I've heard every excuse imaginable, watched liars unravel beneath the weight of their own words, and witnessed ordinary people reveal extraordinary courage when justice demanded it. Most cases fade into memory after the gavel falls, but there are a few that refuse to leave you. They linger long after the courtroom empties, long after the transcripts are filed away. This is one of those cases. Even now, years later, I can still picture the courtroom exactly as it looked that morning. The fluorescent lights reflected across the polished wooden benches. Jurors quietly organized their notebooks. Spectators whispered to one another while waiting for another routine civil dispute to begin. Everyone expected a simple disagreement over property damage and unpaid medical expenses. Frankly, so did I. If someone had told me that before noon the entire courtroom would be sitting in absolute silence and that I would struggle to maintain my own composure, I wouldn't have believed them. Believe me, what happened next changed the way I looked at courage forever. The bailiff called the first case. The plaintiff entered first. Her name was Emily Parker, a successful 43-year-old business executive from Columbus, Ohio. She wore an expensive navy blue suit that looked freshly tailored, carried herself with unmistakable confidence, and walked toward the plaintiff's table without acknowledging anyone else in the room. Her attorney followed closely behind, carrying several thick folders stacked with photographs and documents. Everything about Emily suggested preparation. Everything about her suggested control. Then the defendant walked through the courtroom doors. The room changed. He wasn't surrounded by lawyers. He wasn't carrying stacks of evidence. He wasn't even dressed for court in the way most people try to impress a judge. He wore an old denim jacket neatly folded over one arm, polished boots that had clearly seen decades of use, and a faded button-down shirt tucked carefully into pressed trousers. His silver hair was trimmed short. His back remained remarkably straight despite his age. The clerk quietly confirmed his identity. Richard Lawson, 82 years old. He thanked her with a smile so genuine that even she smiled back. Years on the bench teach you to study people before they ever speak. Their walk, their posture, their eyes. Their silence often tells me more than testimony ever will. Richard Lawson never glanced toward Emily, not once. Instead, he stood respectfully beside the defense table and slowly removed a worn military cap from his hands before placing it beside his notebook. That small gesture caught my attention immediately. Military discipline doesn't disappear with age. You recognize it almost instantly. Emily noticed the cap too. She leaned toward her attorney and laughed quietly. It wasn't loud enough for the court reporter to record, but I saw it. I also saw Richard hear it. He simply lowered his eyes. No reaction. No anger. No embarrassment, just silence. That silence bothered me more than any argument could have. The complaint itself appeared straightforward. Emily claimed Richard had deliberately shoved her during an argument outside a grocery store parking lot, causing her to fall and injure her shoulder. She was demanding compensation for medical treatment, emotional distress, and damage to her vehicle after what she described as an aggressive physical confrontation initiated by an unstable elderly man. It sounded serious. If true, Richard faced devastating financial consequences. Emily's attorney presented enlarged photographs showing scratches along the passenger side of a luxury SUV. Medical records documented a fractured collarbone. Witness statements had already been submitted. Everything looked remarkably organized, perhaps a little too organized. That thought stayed quietly in the back of my mind. Richard had no attorney. When I asked whether he understood his right to legal representation, he nodded calmly. "I understand, Your Honor." His voice was steady. "I'd rather tell the truth myself. Simple, respectful, no theatrics. I've learned that confidence can come from innocence or from experience. Determining which one you're looking at is often the hardest part of judging a case." Emily's attorney began outlining the incident. According to their version, Richard became enraged after Emily accidentally parked too close to him. He allegedly screamed at her, slammed his fists against her vehicle, shoved her violently, and then threatened her before leaving the scene. As I listened, something felt incomplete. Not wrong. Incomplete. Every story has a rhythm. Truth usually flows naturally. Fabricated stories often arrive polished, rehearsed, and perfectly symmetrical. This presentation felt almost rehearsed. Still, suspicion isn't evidence. Facts are. When Emily herself took the stand, she maintained unwavering eye contact. She answered every question immediately, never hesitated, never searched for words, Some judges mistake certainty for credibility. I never have. Because genuine memories often contain pauses, real trauma rarely follows a script. As Emily described the confrontation, I watched Richard, not her. He remained perfectly still. His expression never changed. His hands rested quietly together. But then I noticed something. His right hand trembled ever so slightly whenever Emily claimed he had attacked her, not from anger, not from fear, from something deeper, recognition, pain, or perhaps restraint. I couldn't tell, not yet. Then Emily looked directly toward him. "You've fooled people your entire life with that old man act," she said, "but you're not fooling anyone today." The courtroom became unusually quiet. Richard slowly looked up for the first time since proceedings began. Their eyes met. There was sadness in his face, not hatred, not resentment, just sadness. And that's when I realized this case wasn't about a parking lot. It wasn't about a damaged SUV. It wasn't even about money. There was a history sitting silently between these two people, a history no one had mentioned, not yet. Then Richard quietly asked me a question that instantly changed the direction of the trial. "Your Honor, before I answer any accusations," he paused. "May I remove my jacket?" I nodded. I had no idea that within seconds every assumption inside my courtroom was about to be challenged, and neither did anyone else the moment I nodded. Richard Lawson thanked me with the same quiet respect he had shown since entering my courtroom. "I appreciate it, Your Honor." There was nothing dramatic about the way he spoke, no attempt to gain sympathy, no carefully rehearsed performance. After decades on the bench, I have developed an instinct for people who perform emotion and those who simply carry it. Richard belonged to the second group. He carefully placed his denim jacket over the back of his chair. Then, with deliberate movements, he began unfastening the cuffs of his shirt. The entire courtroom watched. Emily Parker folded her arms, an impatient smile spreading across her face, as though she expected another theatrical stunt from an elderly defendant trying to avoid responsibility. Her attorney didn't object. In fact, he appeared almost amused. I remember thinking that confidence in a courtroom can be dangerous. Sometimes it's earned. Sometimes it's built on the mistaken belief that the truth has already been captured on paper. Richard slowly rolled one sleeve above his elbow, then the other. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but what I saw immediately forced me to sit a little straighter. Both of his forearms were covered with scars, not one or two dozens. Some were thin and faded with age. Others were deep, uneven lines that had clearly healed decades earlier. They weren't accidental cuts. They were the kind of scars that tell stories no words can fully explain. The courtroom noticed them too. The whispers began almost instantly. The bailiff turned toward the spectators with a warning glance, restoring silence before it spread. Richard looked at me. "I wasn't trying to hide these, Your Honor." He paused. "I just didn't think they mattered." I folded my hands. "Why do you believe they matter now, Mr. Lawson?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because the woman accusing me said I attacked her with these hands." He slowly raised them in front of the courtroom. "I'd like the court to understand what these hands have been through." There was no self-pity, only honesty. Years of judging have taught me that people reveal themselves through what they choose not to exaggerate. Richard never once asked anyone to feel sorry for him. He simply to be asked understood. Emily rolled her eyes. "Your Honor, with all due respect, none of this changes what he did." I glanced toward her. "It may not." Then I looked back at Richard. "But the court will hear him." He nodded. "When I was 19, I enlisted." He never mentioned medals. He never mentioned heroics. He simply described service. He spoke about freezing nights, about carrying wounded friends, about learning that courage often means continuing to move while you're terrified. As he spoke, I noticed something remarkable. His story never centered on himself. Every meaningful moment involved someone else, a fellow soldier, a medic, a commanding officer. That humility struck me. People inventing heroic histories usually make themselves the center of every scene. Richard barely mentioned himself at all. Then he said something that caused me to stop taking notes. "I lost most of the strength in my right shoulder 51 years ago." He gently rotated his arm. The movement was limited, painfully limited. "The doctors rebuilt what they could." He smiled faintly. "They did better than anyone expected." Emily's attorney stood. "Objection, relevance." I answered immediately. "Overruled." Then I turned back toward Richard. He continued. "They told me I'd never lift my arm above my shoulder again." He demonstrated. The courtroom watched as his arm struggled to rise. It stopped well below chest level. He tried again. No matter how much effort he applied, the arms simply would not obey. Silence settled over every seat. Even Emily's attorney stopped writing. Richard lowered his arm. I've lived with that limitation for half a century. He looked toward me. That's why I asked permission to remove my jacket. I felt the atmosphere shift, not because sympathy had entered the room, because facts had. If Richard truly lacked the physical ability to perform the violent shove described by Emily's complaint, then the foundation of the entire lawsuit deserved closer examination. Still, experience has taught me something equally important. Physical limitations do not automatically prove innocence. Evidence does. I wasn't ready to draw conclusions, not yet. Emily leaned forward confidently. He pushed me with his left arm. Richard slowly nodded. I expected you'd say that. There was no anger in his voice, only disappointment, almost as though he'd rehearsed that answer in his own mind long before arriving. That response caught my attention. He hadn't reacted emotionally. He'd anticipated the accusation. Why? That question stayed with me. I asked Richard directly. If you didn't assault Ms. Parker, then tell me what happened. He took a slow breath. Then, for the first time that morning, emotion appeared in his eyes. I was standing beside my truck loading groceries. I heard someone scream. It wasn't a scream for help. It was a scream of anger, he described, turning around. Emily had been shouting at a young supermarket employee, no older than 18, because several shopping carts had rolled near her SUV during a sudden gust of wind. According to Richard, the frightened employee repeatedly apologized. Emily continued yelling. Customers stopped walking. Pot pulled their children closer. No one intervened. I've seen fear before, Your Honor. He looked down briefly. I recognized it on that young man's face. Then he said, quietly, so I walked over. Every person in my courtroom was listening now. Even the court reporter seemed to type more slowly. Richard explained that he never touched Emily. Instead, he politely asked her to stop shouting at the employee. According to him, that simple request changed everything. Emily allegedly turned her anger toward him. She insulted his age, his appearance, his military cap. She allegedly laughed when she noticed his limited arm movement. Then Richard said something that sent a chill through the courtroom. She told me he hesitated for the first time. That old men like me should stay home because we're nothing but burdens. No one moved, no one spoke. I looked toward Emily. For the first time all morning, she avoided my eyes. That tiny moment lasted barely 2 seconds, but years on the bench have taught me never to ignore the smallest crack in someone's confidence. It was the first crack I had seen. Then Richard quietly reached into the folder he had brought with him. Unlike Emily's stacks of organized exhibits, his folder was worn and nearly empty. He removed a single folded sheet of paper. He held it gently, almost reluctantly. Your Honor, I wasn't planning to show this, but after hearing today's testimony, I think the court deserves to know why this encounter wasn't random. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear pages turning in the jury box. Richard unfolded the document carefully. Then he looked at me with eyes that carried decades of grief. I knew Emily Parker long before that parking lot, and in that instant I realized this wasn't merely a dispute between strangers. It was the reopening of a wound that had been buried for years. When Richard Lawson uttered those words, I knew Emily Parker long before that parking lot. I felt the atmosphere inside my courtroom shift in a way that cannot be captured in any transcript. I've learned something after decades on the bench. The truth rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in pieces. One small fact exposes another, and eventually the entire story you've been hearing begins to collapse under its own weight. I looked directly at Emily. Until that moment, she had answered every question with remarkable confidence. Her posture had been flawless, her expression carefully controlled, but when Richard spoke her name as though he had known her for years, she blinked only once. Then she looked away. Most people would never notice something that subtle judges do. Those tiny moments often matter more than dramatic outbursts. Mr. Lawson, I said calmly, explain to the court what you mean. He nodded. His hands rested quietly on the witness stand. I've never been close to Miss Parker. He paused, but I knew her father. Emily's attorney immediately stood. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. I didn't even look in his direction. Overruled. Then I turned back toward Richard. Continue. He took a slow breath. Her father was Sergeant William Parker. The name meant nothing to most people sitting inside the courtroom, But Richard's expression changed the moment he spoke it. Respect, grief, memory, all at once. He served beside me. Every eye in the courtroom remained fixed on him. We weren't just soldiers, we survived together. I noticed Emily staring at the table now, not at Richard, not at me. Just the polished wood beneath her hands. Richard continued quietly. There were nights when I believed neither of us would make it home. His voice never cracked, it didn't need to. Some pain becomes too old for tears. He explained how William Parker had once carried him nearly half a mile after an explosion left Richard unable to walk. Then, months later, Richard returned the favor during another attack. I owe my life to that man. Silence, real silence. Not the silence of waiting, the silence of people realizing they're hearing something important. Then Richard looked toward Emily for the first time since entering my courtroom. I attended his funeral. Emily slowly closed her eyes, only for a second. Then she opened them again, still saying nothing. Richard continued. I hadn't seen his daughter in over 25 years. I recognized her immediately. That statement caught my attention. You recognized Ms. Parker in the parking lot? Yes, Your Honor. Did you tell her that? No. Why not? His answer stayed with me long after the trial ended. Because she looked angry. I didn't think she'd want a stranger reminding her of painful memories. There was wisdom in that answer. Not calculation, wisdom. Years teach some people how to win arguments. They teach others when silence is the kinder choice. Richard belonged to the second group. Emily's attorney rose again. Mr. Lawson, isn't it true that recognizing my client gave you an emotional reaction? Richard nodded immediately. Yes. So you admit you approached her emotionally. I approached her respectfully. You were upset. I was concerned. Concerned enough to confront her? Richard looked directly at him. I was concerned enough to ask her not to scream at a frightened teenager. The attorney smiled confidently. And that's when you assaulted her. Richard answered without hesitation. No. That single word carried more certainty than 5 minutes of argument. Still, certainty isn't proof. Evidence is. I reminded myself of that constantly, no matter how compelling one witness appears, no matter how sympathetic. Justice demands discipline. Then I asked Emily to return to the witness stand. She walked back with the same confidence she had displayed earlier, but something had changed very slightly. She no longer looked toward Richard. Instead, she answered only my questions. Ms. Parker, I began, did you know Mr. Lawson knew your father? No. Her response came quickly, almost too quickly. You've never met him before? No. Richard quietly lowered his eyes. I watched both of them carefully. One appeared saddened. The other appeared defensive. Neither reaction proved anything, but they were different, very different. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my mind. Miss Parker, when the incident occurred, did Mr. Lawson ever mention Sergeant William Parker? There was the briefest pause, less than 2 seconds, then, no. The answer sounded clean, controlled, practiced. Richard never interrupted. He simply reached inside his folder once again. I believe this may help. He handed a small photograph to the bailiff. The photograph eventually reached my bench. It showed 2 young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder decades earlier. One was unmistakably Richard, the other matched Emily's father from the obituary attached to the court record. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, were just 6 words, brothers until the very end, dated 48 years earlier. I looked up. Richard wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't even looking at me. He was looking at the photograph as though he hadn't seen it in years. Then he quietly said something I never expected. I promised William I'd always look after his family. Emily suddenly spoke. I don't need you looking after me. Her voice was sharp, almost angry. Richard nodded gently. I know, but promises don't disappear just because time passes. The courtroom remained perfectly still. I noticed several jurors exchanging brief glances, not because they had made up their minds, because they sensed something larger than the lawsuit itself. There was history here, pain, loss, something unresolved. Then Emily's attorney requested permission to introduce surveillance footage from the grocery store. He sounded confident again, very confident. This video will conclusively establish what happened. I approved the request. The courtroom lights dimmed. The large evidence screen flickered to life. I expected clarity. Instead, within the first few seconds, I noticed something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The timestamp didn't match the incident report, and that was only the beginning. The courtroom lights dimmed until the only glow came from the evidence screen hanging above the witness stand. I've watched thousands of surveillance videos throughout my career. Most are grainy, most are incomplete. Most answer one question while creating three more. But before this recording had even played for 10 seconds, something bothered me. Not the people, not the parking lot, the timestamp. It was wrong. Just enough to make me stop the playback. Pause the video. The clerk froze the frame. Every eye in the courtroom shifted toward me. Emily's attorney looked puzzled. Your Honor? I leaned slightly forward. This incident allegedly occurred at 3:42 p.m., correct? I pointed toward the corner of the screen. This footage begins at 4:17 p.m. He glanced back. It's only a difference of 35 minutes. Only that word caught my attention. There is no such thing as only 35 minutes when you're asking a court to determine the truth. Do you have the complete recording? His confidence faded for the first time. This is the portion provided to us. Provided by whom? The grocery store. I looked toward the bailiff. I'd like the custodian of records sworn in. A middle-aged man named Thomas Green, the grocery store's operations manager, stepped forward. He appeared uncomfortable before he had even taken the oath. I've learned to recognize the posture of someone who wishes they were somewhere else. Mr. Green avoided eye contact with nearly everyone. After he was sworn in, I asked a simple question. Did your store provide this edited video to the plaintiff? He hesitated. That hesitation lasts barely 3 seconds, but 3 seconds can echo loudly in a courtroom. We provided the segment requested. The segment requested? Yes, Your Honor. So this is not the complete recording? No. A murmur spread across the gallery before the bailiff restored order. I kept my voice calm. How much footage exists? Approximately 1 hour. The silence that followed was heavier than any objection. I turned toward Emily's attorney. Were you aware additional footage existed? He cleared his throat. My office received what we believed was the relevant portion. Believed, another carefully chosen word. I wasn't interested in assumptions. I was interested in evidence. Mr. Green, I asked, does the complete recording still exist? Yes. Has it been altered? No, Your Honor. Can it be produced immediately? He nodded. Our security office can transmit it electronically within a few minutes. Do so. While the court waited, I observed everyone in the room. Richard remained exactly as he had been all morning, calm, patient, almost detached. Emily was different. She had begun tapping her fingers against the table, not loudly, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. Years on the bench have taught me something curious. When facts are uncertain, people often become restless. When facts are certain but dangerous, they become even more restless. I wasn't ready to decide which applied to Emily, not yet. 22 minutes later, the complete surveillance recording arrived. I instructed the clerk to verify its chain of custody before it was displayed. No shortcuts. Justice deserves patience. The screen came alive once again. This time, we started from the beginning. At 3:18 p.m., Richard Lawson's pickup truck entered the parking lot. He parked carefully between the lines. He stepped out slowly, using the truck door for balance. Nothing unusual. He collected a shopping cart and disappeared inside the store. Nearly 15 minutes later, Emily Parker's SUV pulled in. She parked several spaces away. Again, nothing unusual. Then the wind picked up. The parking lot cameras showed shopping carts drifting across the asphalt. One lightly bumped the passenger side of Emily's vehicle. She exited immediately, even without audio. Her body language told its own story. Fast movements, sharp gestures. Pointing, an employee hurried toward her, a teenager, exactly as Richard had described. The young man repeatedly apologized. He retrieved the cart. He appeared visibly nervous. Emily continued speaking, even without sound. Everyone in that courtroom could see the intensity of the confrontation. Then Richard exited the store carrying 2 grocery bags. He noticed the argument. He stopped walking. He watched for several seconds, just as he had testified. Then he approached. I slowed the playback. Richard never rushed, never raised his arms, never invaded Emily's personal space. He simply stood beside the young employee. His lips moved. Whatever he said, it was brief. Emily turned toward him immediately. Her gestures became even more animated. She stepped closer, closer still. Richard never advanced. Not once. I paused the recording. Continue in slow motion. Frame by frame, the courtroom watched. Emily pointed directly at Richard's chest. He remained still. She leaned forward. He took one small step backward. Then something happened that no one had mentioned. Emily shoved him, not hard enough to knock him down, but hard enough to force him backward against a parked shopping cart. An audible gasp filled the courtroom. I didn't speak. The video continued. Richard regained his balance. His hands remained at his sides. He never struck her, never lunged, never threatened. Then Emily took another step. Her heel landed on a loose shopping cart wheel. It pivoted unexpectedly. She lost her balance, reached for the SUV, missed, and fell backward onto the pavement. The courtroom fell into complete silence, not the silence of surprise. The silence of realization. Everything changed in those 5 seconds. Richard didn't celebrate. He didn't walk away. He immediately bent down, slowly, awkwardly, because of his injured shoulder, and tried to help her up. She slapped his hand away. Then she pointed at him. Even without audio, everyone understood the accusation. I stopped the recording. No one moved. I looked toward Emily. She stared at the table. Then I looked toward Richard. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at Emily, not with anger, not with triumph, only sadness. But something still bothered me. One question remained unanswered. If the video clearly contradicted Emily's account, why had she seemed so confident from the very beginning? People rarely build an entire lawsuit around evidence they know can destroy them, unless they believe the most important evidence will never be seen. That thought stayed with me. Then the operations manager quietly raised his hand. Your Honor, I need to tell the court something else. I turned toward him. He looked pale. There was another camera. The room froze. It wasn't pointed at the parking lot. It was pointed directly at the two of them. My instincts told me that whatever was on that second recording wasn't just going to resolve the case. It was about to expose the real reason Richard Lawson had been dragged into my courtroom in the first place. I have often said that the most dangerous moment in a courtroom is not when someone lies. It is when a lie is about to meet undeniable truth. As the grocery store manager uttered the words, "There was another camera." I felt every person in my courtroom become perfectly still. Even the attorneys stopped shuffling papers. For the first time that morning, Emily Parker looked genuinely afraid, not anxious, not frustrated. Afraid. There is a difference, and after decades on the bench, I know it when I see it. I looked at Thomas Green. Why wasn't this camera mentioned earlier? He swallowed hard. It wasn't part of the initial request, Your Honor. Where was it located? Above the store entrance. What does it show? He hesitated. It captures everyone entering and leaving the building and the entire conversation area outside the front doors. A camera that overlooked the exact place where the confrontation began. I leaned back slightly. So, unlike the parking lot camera, yes, Your Honor. This one includes audio. The words landed like a hammer. Audio. That meant no guessing, no lip reading, no competing memories, just the truth. I ordered the recording admitted into evidence after verifying its authenticity and chain of custody. The courtroom remained silent as the screen flickered to life once again. Richard appeared first, leaving the store with 2 paper grocery bags. He paused to let an elderly woman exit ahead of him, holding the automatic door open with his left hand, a small gesture, one that no one had mentioned, one that told me something about his character without a single word. Then Emily entered the frame. She was already upset. The young grocery employee followed close behind, apologizing repeatedly. This time, we could hear everything. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," the teenager said nervously. "It was the wind. I'll move the carts right now." Emily's voice was sharp. "I don't pay luxury car insurance so careless kids like you can damage my vehicle." The young employee apologized again. His voice shook. "I'll get my manager." "No," Emily snapped. "You're going to stand here and explain why you people hire idiots." Several customers stopped walking. Some looked uncomfortable. Others simply kept moving. I've seen this countless times. Most people want conflict to disappear. Very few are willing to step into it. Then Richard approached. His tone was calm. "Ma'am," the entire courtroom listened. "I think he's apologized enough." Nothing aggressive, nothing threatening, just 7 simple words. Emily turned immediately. "This doesn't concern you." Richard nodded politely. "You're right." He started to walk away, then he stopped. "I just don't think anyone deserves to be spoken to that way." That was it. That was the sentence that changed everything. Emily laughed. Not the laugh of amusement, the laugh people sometimes use to humiliate another person. She looked directly at Richard's military cap. "Oh, wonderful! A hero complex!" Richard remained silent. Then she noticed his shoulder, the limited movement. She smirked. You can barely move, so why don't you mind your own business before you fall over? No response. Richard simply stood there. Years ago, I learned that true self-control isn't staying calm when people are respectful. It's remaining calm when someone tries to strip away your dignity. Richard passed that test without effort. Emily wasn't finished. She stepped closer. I've had enough of old men thinking they're entitled to lectures. Then she noticed the military insignia stitched onto his cap. Her expression changed. Oh, so that's why. She laughed again. My father was in the military. He actually accomplished something. The courtroom gasped softly as the recording played. Richard lowered his eyes. Very quietly, he asked one question. What was your father's name? William Parker. The moment she answered, Richard froze, not dramatically. Just enough that anyone paying attention could see it. He looked at her with disbelief. I served with William. Emily frowned. No, you didn't. Yes, I knew him. He saved my life. For the first time in the recording, Richard smiled. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the smile of someone recognizing a piece of the past. I promised him I'd always look after his family if I ever had the chance. The courtroom watched in complete silence. Emily's face hardened. My father is dead. I know. You don't get to use him to manipulate me. Richard shook his head. I'm not trying to manipulate you. I'm trying to honor him. Then came the moment I'll never forget. Emily stepped forward, placed both hands against Richard's chest, and shoved him. He stumbled backward, regained his balance, never raised a hand, never threatened her, never even raised his voice. Instead, he said something so quietly that the courtroom had to lean in to hear it. Your father would be heartbroken to see this. Those words struck harder than any physical blow. Emily's expression changed instantly. Rage replaced embarrassment. You don't know anything about my father? She lunged toward him again. Richard instinctively stepped backward, exactly as the parking lot footage had shown. Her heel caught the loose shopping cart. She lost her footing. She fell. Everything matched perfectly. Every second, every movement, every accusation she'd made against Richard collapsed before our eyes. But the recording wasn't finished. Richard immediately reached down. Please, let me help you. Emily slapped his hand away. Then she looked around. She saw people watching, and she shouted words that echoed through the courtroom even now. He attacked me. Several bystanders rushed over. One woman immediately said, No, ma'am. We all saw what happened. Emily ignored her. Instead, she pulled out her phone. I want the police. The video ended. No one spoke. I looked toward Emily. She was crying now, not loudly, quickly. Whether those tears came from guilt, humiliation, grief, or all three, I couldn't yet say. But then the prosecutor requested permission to introduce one final piece of evidence that no one, including Richard, knew existed. A responding police officer had been wearing a body camera. And according to the prosecution, Richard had never seen what that camera captured after officers arrived. When I heard those words, I realized the most important truth of the entire case still hadn't been revealed. And what that body camera recorded would forever change the way everyone in my courtroom viewed justice, forgiveness, and one aging veteran's extraordinary character. There are moments in a judge's career when the law and humanity stand side by side. This was one of them. As the responding officer's body camera footage was admitted into evidence, I reminded myself of the oath I had taken decades earlier. Sympathy could never replace proof. Anger could never replace fairness. No matter how compelling Richard Lawson appeared, my responsibility remained exactly the same: find the truth, nothing more, nothing less. The courtroom lights dimmed one final time. The recording began only moments after officers arrived at the grocery store. People were still gathered around the entrance. Emily Parker was sitting on the curb, holding her shoulder. Richard stood nearly 20 feet away. He hadn't attempted to leave. He hadn't argued with anyone. He simply waited. The first officer approached Emily. Ma'am, tell me what happened. She pointed directly at Richard. That man assaulted me. The officer nodded professionally. Then he walked over to Richard. Sir, I'd like to hear your side. Richard removed his military cap. I'll answer everything. Pushed. The officer asked whether he had pushed Emily. No, officer. Did you touch her? I tried to help her after she fell. Why? Richard looked genuinely surprised by the question. Because she was hurt, the officer continued. Even after she accused you? Richard's answer settled over my courtroom like a quiet truth. My father taught me that another person's character doesn't excuse me from having my own. For a moment, I forgot I was watching evidence. I was simply listening. The officer then interviewed several witnesses, one after another. Their statements were remarkably consistent. The young grocery employee, an elderly couple, a delivery driver, a mother shopping with her 2 children, every single one described the same sequence of events. Richard had remained calm. Emily had become increasingly aggressive. Richard never struck her, never threatened her, never even raised his voice. Then came the part no one had expected. The officer looked at Richard. "Sir, would you like to pursue assault charges?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He looked toward Emily. She was still sitting on the curb, visibly upset. Then he quietly replied, "No." The officer frowned. "She pushed you. I know. Several witnesses saw it. I know. You have every right to file a complaint." Richard smiled gently. Rights and wisdom aren't always the same thing. The officer asked why. Richard took a slow breath before answering. "Because I knew her father." There it was again, not anger, not revenge. A promise. The body camera captured every word that followed. "I served with William Parker. He once carried me through enemy fire. If he's watching today, I'd rather honor his memory than punish his daughter." The officer stood silent. Even through the recording, I could see the respect in his face. Richard continued, "I don't know what she's been through. I don't know why she's carrying so much anger, but I know the man who raised her, and I refuse to let his legacy end with bitterness." The recording ended. No one moved. I looked across my courtroom. Several jurors had tears in their eyes. The court reporter had stopped typing for a moment before quietly continuing. Even the bailiff, a former Marine who rarely showed emotion, stared at the floor. Then I looked at Emily. She wasn't crying because she had lost the case. She was crying because she had finally heard something she had spent years trying to outrun. I asked softly, "Mrs. Parker, would you like to say anything before the court rules?" She stood slowly. Gunn was the confident executive who had entered my courtroom that morning. Her shoulders had collapsed beneath a weight no lawsuit could explain. She looked at Richard, not at me. I lied. The words barely escaped her lips. I lied about all of it. The courtroom remained silent. She wiped away tears. "My father," she struggled to continue, "was my hero. When he came home from the war, he wasn't the same." She explained that he suffered from nightmares, depression, and years of emotional isolation before passing away. As a young woman, she hadn't understood his pain. Instead, she grew resentful. After his death, that resentment hardened into anger she carried into every part of her life. When I saw Mr. Lawson wearing that military cap, I remembered my father, and instead of remembering the good man he was, I remembered my own pain. She turned toward Richard. "When you said you knew him, I couldn't bear hearing someone speak about him with love, so I wanted everyone to believe you were the villain." Richard listened without interruption. When she finished, I addressed the courtroom. "The evidence is overwhelming. The plaintiff knowingly presented false testimony. The surveillance recordings, witness statements, and body camera footage leave no room for reasonable doubt." I dismissed every civil claim against Richard Lawson. Then I referred the matter for review regarding possible sanctions for filing a knowingly false claim and providing false testimony under oath. Justice required that outcome. The law demanded it. But before I struck the gavel, something happened that no statute could require. Richard slowly walked toward Emily. The bailiff instinctively stepped forward. Richard simply smiled. "It's all right." He stopped a respectful distance away. From his jacket pocket, he removed the faded photograph of 2 young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. He held it out. "I think your father would have wanted you to have this." Emily stared at the picture. Her hands trembled as she accepted it. On the back, in faded handwriting, were the same 6 words I had read earlier, "brothers until the very end." She broke down completely, not because she had been exposed, because, for the first time in years, someone had given her a memory of her father untouched by anger. Richard quietly placed his military cap back on his head. "I forgave you before this trial ever started." Then he turned and walked toward the courtroom doors. No celebration, no victory speech, no bitterness, just quiet dignity. I watched him leave until the doors closed behind him. I've sentenced violent criminals. I've ruled in multi-million-dollar disputes. I've heard confessions that still echo in my mind. Yet when people ask me which case I remember most, I think of an 82-year-old veteran who rolled up his sleeves, revealed scars that told only part of his story, and proved that the strongest person in a courtroom isn't always the one who wins. Sometimes It's the one who has every reason to seek revenge and chooses mercy instead. Justice is not merely about exposing lies, it is about protecting truth. And truth, unlike anger, never needs to shout to be heard. That day, the law did its job. But it was one veteran's grace that taught everyone in my courtroom, including me, that character is measured not by the wounds we carry, but by what we choose to do with them. That lesson has stayed with me ever since.